There is a silence that carries more power than 1,000 words. In that silence lives a being who has learned not only to feel deeply, but to observe deeply. This being is the Super Empath. The empath does not torture with knives. The empath does not punish with fire. The torture begins when the empath finally sees. The narcissist enters with confidence, grand, polished, and loud. They thrive in confusion, hiding behind masks. But the Super Empath, they see the crack behind the smile, the tremble behind the laugh. They feel what is unspoken, and they remain still. In the beginning, the narcissist feeds on attention, admiration, and validation. This is their air, their lifeline, and the empath breathes out love without effort. They give freely, not because they are weak, but because that is their nature, to give. But something changes. The empath learns. They begin to notice that their giving does not lead to harmony, but hunger, that their light is not honored, but stolen. They do not fight. They do not beg. They do not scream. They simply withdraw, and that is the beginning of the end. To the narcissist, the silence of the empath is unbearable. The calm gaze of the one who now sees through illusion becomes a mirror too painful to face. No anger, no drama, just truth. The empath's energy no longer flows toward the narcissist. No arguments, no attempts to fix, just presence. Pure, untouchable, sovereign presence. The narcissist cannot manipulate what does not react. They cannot control what does not move. They cannot feed on what does not offer. And here is the paradox. The torture is not inflicted intentionally. The empath does not seek revenge. They only return to themselves. They reclaim their space. They rise, not to harm, but to heal. But to a narcissist, healing is torture. For in the presence of true light, all shadows become visible, and there is nowhere to hide. The Super Empath becomes the unshakable mountain. Grounded, rooted, still, and the narcissist, once the storm, becomes like wind, thrashing against stone, desperate for impact. But the mountain does not move. The empath's silence becomes the narcissist's greatest torment. At first glance, this may seem like a paradox. After all, silence is often equated with peace, stillness, or even surrender. But to the narcissist, who thrives on chaos, validation, and control, silence is not a neutral force. It is an act of quiet rebellion. It is the moment the game ends, the mirror shatters, and the narcissist is left alone with the one thing they fear most, themselves. In the early stages of any interaction between an empath and a narcissist, the energy is unbalanced but dynamic. The empath, sensitive and intuitive, offers love without precondition. They give freely time, attention, affection, understanding. They sense the wounds in the narcissist, even if they can't name them. They feel the pain hiding behind the bravado, and they are drawn to heal it. But the narcissist does not view the empath as a healer. They see a source of supply, of energy, adoration, emotional responsiveness, and affirmation of their false self. The narcissist learns early how to mirror, charm, and seduce. They know how to mimic empathy, how to pretend they care, how to reflect the light of the empath back to them, just enough to keep them engaged. For the empath, who feels things deeply and wants to believe in the goodness of others, this creates a powerful illusion. The bond seems profound, but over time, the empath begins to notice patterns. The warmth they offer is not reciprocated. The understanding they extend is manipulated. Their kindness is seen not as a gift, but as a tool, something the narcissist bends and shapes to maintain control. When the empath starts to awaken to this imbalance, the shift begins. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow dawning realization, a growing discomfort in the body, a tightening in the chest, a gut feeling that something is not right. Words are no longer trusted. Promises feel hollow. The empath begins to pull back, not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. They stop explaining. They stop defending. They stop reacting. And that is where the silence begins. This silence is not passive. It is not the silence of resignation. It is an active, conscious silence, a powerful withdrawal of energy. The empath is no longer feeding the narcissist's need for control, no longer giving them the emotional highs and lows they crave, no longer dancing in the storm of confusion and gaslighting. They become still. The narcissist, on the other hand, experiences this silence as an existential threat. To them, emotional chaos is sustenance. Drama is proof of importance. Argument is a form of connection. When the empath ceases to engage, the narcissist finds themselves in a vacuum. The attention they once took for granted is gone. The predictable supply of emotional fuel has disappeared. The mirror no longer reflects. The stage is empty, and the audience has walked out. The narcissist is addicted to reaction. They feed on the empath's tears, anger, confusion, and even affection. Each reaction is proof that they matter, that they are in control, that they still hold power. But the empath's silence removes all of that. There is no more fuel, no more reflection, no more response. And in that absence, the narcissist is forced to face the hollowness within. Silence is also a language. To the narcissist, it speaks volumes. It says, "I see you." It says, "You have no more power here." It says, "I am not yours to bend." And though the empath may not speak these words aloud, their absence of response delivers the message more clearly than any confrontation ever could. The narcissist, desperate to re-establish control, may escalate their behavior. They may lash out, love, bomb, threaten, guilt, trip, or manipulate with new intensity. They will say anything to provoke a reaction, to restore the dynamic where they feel superior and the empath feels uncertain. But when the empath remains silent, when they refuse to step back into the emotional theater, the narcissist's tools begin to fail. The torment lies in the narcissist's loss of relevance. Their identity is shaped by the way others perceive them. Without the empath's emotional reactions, their constructed self-image starts to crack. They are no longer the center of attention. They are no longer the puppet master. They are simply alone. The empath, however, is not silent because they lack words. They are silent because they have nothing left to prove. They are not trying to win. They are not seeking revenge. They are reclaiming space. The silence is not a punishment. It is a boundary, a line drawn in quiet dignity. And for the narcissist, that boundary is unbearable. The true power of this silence lies in its spiritual clarity. The empath is not suppressing their voice. They are rising into a different kind of strength. A strength that no longer seeks to be understood by the one who cannot understand. A strength that no longer tries to convince someone who benefits from misunderstanding. A strength that does not chase, beg, or explain. It simply is. The narcissist who once fed on the empath's empathy finds themselves starved, not because the empath turned cruel, but because they finally turned inward. They began to prioritize their own peace, their own clarity, their own wholeness. And in doing so, they rendered the narcissist powerless. To an outside observer, this silence may appear subtle, but within the dynamic, it is seismic. It is the collapse of a structure built on illusion. The narcissist, once towering in perceived dominance, finds their influence reduced to shadows, and there is nothing more torturous to them than being ignored by the very person whose energy once sustained them. The empath, meanwhile, does not seek to torture. They seek to live. Their silence is not vengeance. It is wisdom. They have seen enough, felt enough. They know now that their light is not meant to be consumed by those who offer nothing in return. And so, they rise, not in anger, but in alignment. What the narcissist does not understand is that silence is the empath's final gift. It is the gift of separation, the space to grow, the chance for the narcissist to confront themselves. But most cannot receive it. They misread the silence as insult, as abandonment, as betrayal. They do not see it for what it is, a consequence of their own actions. And so, the torment continues, not because the empath is doing anything to the narcissist, but because they are doing nothing at all. And in that nothingness, all illusions fall apart. The empath's silence is not the absence of love. It is the presence of self-love. It is the recognition that not all battles are meant to be fought, and not all connections are meant to be saved. Some are meant to teach, and once the lesson is learned, the silence becomes the answer. Awareness transforms the empath from giver to observer. This transformation does not happen in a single moment. It unfolds slowly, like dawn breaking after a long night. The empath, by nature, is a being of feeling, tuned to emotional currents, sensitive to unspoken needs, and deeply wired to give. Their giving is not transactional. It is not measured. It flows instinctively from a place of compassion, driven by the desire to nurture, support, and heal. But when this energy meets the manipulative pull of a narcissist, something begins to change. In the early stages of any interaction between an empath and a narcissist, the empath's role is instinctively active. They sense that something is not right beneath the surface of the narcissist's persona. They feel the disconnection, the inner pain, the emptiness, but they do not yet fully understand it. What they see on the outside, a charming, confident, even magnetic presence, conflicts with the subtle signals they feel beneath. And so, they do what they have always done. They give their time. They give their love. They give their forgiveness. They give their energy, even when it costs them. At this point, the empath is operating on reflex. They want to help, to fix, to soothe. They believe that if they just give a little more, love a little harder, understand a little deeper, they will finally reach the core of the narcissist and heal what is broken. But that moment never comes. Instead, they find themselves trapped in an ever-expanding loop of confusion, emotional manipulation, and spiritual depletion. And then, the first spark of awareness ignites. The empath begins to feel exhausted. Not the kind of exhaustion that comes from work or effort, but a soul-level fatigue that does not go away with rest. They begin to realize that no matter how much they give, it is never enough. That their love is not being met with love, but with entitlement. That their vulnerability is being used not for connection, but for control. This is the beginning of transformation. The empath starts to watch, not with judgment, but with curiosity. They begin to notice patterns, how the narcissist reacts when they set boundaries, how affection is withdrawn when they do not comply, how their words are twisted to create doubt. The empath begins to see that the relationship is not a partnership, but a performance. And they are playing a role they never agreed to. As awareness grows, the empath starts to pull back, not physically at first, but emotionally and mentally. They begin to question their own responses. Why do I feel guilty when I say no? Why do I feel anxious around someone who claims to love me? Why do I feel invisible in conversations that are supposed to be about mutual care? With these questions, a new perspective forms. The empath shifts from being inside the emotional storm to standing slightly outside of it. They begin to observe not just the narcissist, but themselves. They start to understand their own patterns. the ways they override their instincts to please others, the way they ignore their own pain to keep the peace, the way they justify toxic behavior out of fear of conflict. This self-observation is not cold or detached. It is gentle but firm. The empath begins to develop a new kind of strength, the strength to see things as they are, rather than as they wish them to be. They no longer rush to fix every emotional fracture. They no longer absorb every insult and convert it into understanding. They start to hold space, not just for others, but for themselves. The narcissist notices the change, although they may not understand it. They may interpret it as distance, resistance, or defiance. They may accuse the empath of being cold or selfish. But the truth is that the empath is not becoming colder. They are becoming clearer. This clarity does not come without pain. The empath must face many difficult truths. They must accept that their love cannot heal someone who does not want to be healed. They must acknowledge that their kindness has been used as a weapon against them. They must come to terms with the fact that they were not seen as a person, but as a resource. And in that acknowledgement, a kind of grief sets in. Not just grief for what was lost, but grief for what never was. But through this grief, awareness continues to grow. The empath begins to see through the narcissist's tactics, the gaslighting, the projection, the guilt trips, the sudden charm. They begin to recognize these behaviors not as mysterious or powerful, but as predictable. The magic spell breaks, the emotional fog lifts, the empath is no longer enchanted. They see the narcissist clearly, not as a monster, but as a wounded manipulator, a person who uses others to feel whole because they cannot face their own emptiness. This realization does not produce hate in the empath. It produces detachment. The empath no longer feels compelled to rescue the narcissist. They stop trying to explain, to prove, to defend. They no longer need to be understood by someone who is committed to misunderstanding them. Their energy is no longer invested in external repair, but in internal restoration. The transformation from giver to observer is not about becoming numb. It is about becoming discerning. The empath still feels deeply, but they no longer allow those feelings to override their judgment. They still care, but they no longer sacrifice themselves to care for someone who repeatedly causes harm. They still listen, but they also listen to themselves. Their intuition becomes their guide, not their guilt, not their hope, not their longing. As the empath continues to observe, they begin to develop emotional boundaries. These boundaries are not walls, they are filters. The empath no longer lets every emotion in without question. They no longer accept every narrative as truth. They question, they pause, they reflect, and in that reflection, they reclaim power. The narcissist, used to the empath's compliance, becomes unsettled by this change. They may try to reassert control through manipulation, false apologies, or new tactics. But the empath is no longer reacting. They are responding. They are grounded in awareness. And from that place, they make choices not out of fear or obligation, but out of self-respect. This shift from emotional reactivity to conscious observation marks the true emergence of the super empath. The empath who once believed their role was to give at any cost now understands that their true power lies in discernment, in choosing who is worthy of their energy, in recognizing that not all suffering is theirs to fix. The empath also begins to observe the inner workings of their own mind, the conditioning that led them to overgive, the beliefs that tied their worth to being needed, the fears that kept them tethered to toxic cycles. They start to rewrite the narrative. They are not weak for feeling. They are strong for surviving. They are not broken for loving. They are wise for walking away. From this place of observation, the empath becomes centered. They are no longer pulled by the highs and lows of the narcissist's emotional manipulation. They are no longer caught in the cycle of hope and disappointment. They see the cycle for what it is, and they step out. The observer does not need control. They do not need revenge. They do not need to be right. They simply see, and in seeing, they are free. Detachment is the empath's unspoken power. It does not roar, it does not demand, and it does not seek attention. It arrives quietly, after much internal work, after countless moments of confusion, emotional storms, and soul-level exhaustion. But when it comes, it changes everything. Detachment is not coldness. It is not apathy. It is clarity. It is the moment the empath no longer allows their heart to be a battlefield for someone else's ego. It is the quiet strength of choosing self-preservation over emotional entanglement. In the early stages of their dynamic with a narcissist, the empath is deeply involved, not just mentally, but emotionally and energetically. Every slight, every word, every expression from the narcissist touches them. The empath feels responsible. If the narcissist is upset, the empath wants to fix it. If the narcissist is distant, the empath questions what they did wrong. They internalize the disconnection and try to mend it with more love, more patience, more presence. But nothing changes. The narcissist does not truly connect. They respond to the empath's giving with entitlement. They take and take, yet remain emotionally unavailable. Their warmth is conditional, their validation inconsistent. The empath finds themselves constantly guessing, adjusting, and sacrificing to restore harmony. Yet the goalpost always moves. The narcissist is not interested in mutual growth. They are interested in control, in dominance, in feeding their fragile sense of self through the empath's endless supply of attention and care. Eventually, the empath reaches a breaking point. It's not dramatic. It's not always loud, but it is profound. It may come in the form of a quiet realization, I am losing myself. That thought changes everything. The empath begins to notice that they are no longer joyful, no longer expressive, no longer centered in their own body. Their emotions are on a leash, constantly yanked by the narcissist's behavior. They are living reactively, not consciously. They are surviving in a world built by someone else's rules. This is when detachment begins to form, not as an act of revenge, but as a necessary return to self. At first, detachment feels unfamiliar. The empath has built their identity around caring, around being available, around emotionally responding to others. To not respond feels foreign. To not explain feels unnatural. To let things be, without trying to control or heal them, feels like abandonment. But slowly, through awareness and reflection, the empath begins to realize that detachment is not abandonment of love. It is the honoring of it. The empath starts to pull their energy inward. They begin to pause before reacting. They begin to listen to their inner signals. When the narcissist tries to provoke a response, through blame, through guilt, through emotional withdrawal, the empath observes instead of engages. This shift is subtle but powerful. The narcissist feels the difference immediately. Where there was once emotional availability, there is now presence without investment. Where there was once a need to please, there is now self-containment. Detachment strips the narcissist of their power. They rely on the empath's reactions to validate their own importance. Every time the empath cries, apologizes, defends, or begs, the narcissist feels control. But when those reactions stop, the narcissist faces a void. The emotional hooks no longer hold. The dance ends, and the narcissist, who cannot exist outside of constant emotional engagement, begins to unravel. The empath, however, is just beginning to find themselves. Detachment is not the suppression of emotion. It is the reorientation of it. The empath still feels deeply, but their feelings are no longer dictated by the narcissist's moods or manipulations. They begin to feel a different kind of peace, a peace that is not dependent on being understood or accepted by someone who refuses to do either. Detachment also allows the empath to see clearly. Without the fog of emotional dependence, they can finally discern manipulation from authenticity. They begin to recognize how their own empathy was weaponized against them, how they were conditioned to equate love with sacrifice, worth with suffering, loyalty with silence. With this clarity, the empath begins to redefine their boundaries, not as punishments, but as sacred guidelines that protect their emotional well-being. The narcissist may try to re-engage. They may shift tactics, pretend to change, offer grand gestures of affection. But the empath, grounded in detachment, sees through these attempts. They are no longer interested in words without actions, in apologies without change. Detachment gives them the power to walk away, not out of bitterness, but out of knowing they deserve more than emotional crumbs. This does not mean the empath stops caring. It means they stop participating in a dynamic that only depletes them. They no longer confuse compassion with compliance. They understand that loving someone does not require enduring harm. And they no longer allow guilt to override their inner truth. Detachment also deepens the empath's self-connection. As their energy is no longer constantly directed outward, they begin to rediscover their own desires, values, and needs. They remember what joy feels like when it is not filtered through someone else's approval. They begin to nurture themselves in ways they once reserved only for others. This inner nourishment becomes their new source of strength. Where the narcissist once dictated the empath's emotional climate, now the empath sets their own weather. They choose calm. They choose space. They choose stillness. They realize they do not need chaos to feel alive. They do not need drama to feel worthy. They are enough in their own quiet presence. The power of detachment lies in its neutrality. It does not seek to hurt or heal. It simply is. It allows the empath to disengage without hostility, to say, "This is not for me," without needing to justify, to walk away without needing closure. Because the empath has learned that some people do not seek resolution, only repetition. And they are no longer willing to participate in that cycle. Detachment also protects the empath's future. It prevents them from being pulled back into toxic dynamics. It sharpens their discernment. They begin to spot the signs of manipulation early. They trust their instincts without second guessing. They know what it feels like to be drained, and they no longer ignore those signals. Their empathy is still intact, but it is now paired with wisdom. The narcissist, sensing this shift, may feel panic. They are losing control. Their usual methods no longer work. They may accuse the empath of changing, of becoming selfish, of being cold. But the empath knows the truth. They have not become less loving. They have become more discerning about where their love goes. Detachment does not mean the empath has healed all wounds, but it means they are no longer bleeding for someone who keeps cutting. It means they are no longer addicted to potential. They see the reality of the narcissist, not the illusion, and that vision sets them free. There is power in not responding, in choosing silence over argument, in choosing distance over dysfunction, in choosing peace over performance. The empath learns that they do not owe anyone their energy, especially not those who deplete it without care. They begin to feel the strength of their own presence. They realize that their value was never in how much they endured, but in how deeply they could feel and still rise. Detachment allows them to feel fully without being consumed, to love without losing themselves, to give without being drained. The empath, once caught in the web of the narcissist's control, now walks freely. They no longer seek validation from the one who invalidated them. They no longer ask for truth from the one who deals in illusion. They have turned inward, not to escape the world, but to reclaim it from within. The transformation is not visible to the world, but it is felt by the narcissist, who now finds that their words fall flat, their manipulation fails, and their presence no longer has weight, because the empath, once tethered, is now untethered. Once reactive, now composed. Once entangled, now sovereign. Silence becomes the most potent frequency when the empath chooses to no longer participate in the emotional theater constructed by the narcissist. It is not the silence of defeat, nor the silence of avoidance. It is the silence of mastery. A silence that no longer begs to be heard, no longer seeks to explain, no longer fights to be understood by someone who only listens to gain control. This silence is not empty. It is filled with presence, awareness, and an unshakable sense of self that no longer needs to justify its existence through sound or explanation. It is a vibration that speaks louder than words and echoes through the corridors of the narcissist's carefully constructed illusions. In the early stages of their connection, the empath uses words to bridge the emotional divide. They explain, apologize, rationalize, plead, and open their hearts, believing that communication can create understanding. The empath shares their truth, offers their vulnerability, and tries to illuminate the unseen. They use dialogue as a tool of connection, as a way to bring harmony into a space distorted by manipulation. But over time, those words begin to feel like echoes in a void. The narcissist does not listen to understand. They listen to gather data, to find weaknesses, to twist meaning into advantage. Words that were once bridges become weapons in the hands of the narcissist, repurposed to gaslight, to shame, to confuse. The empath starts to notice the pattern. No matter how many times they explain their feelings, the narcissist turns the conversation into a performance. The subject is deflected, the blame is redirected, and the truth is distorted. What begins as an attempt to resolve pain ends in greater pain. Each argument leaves the empath more depleted, each confession more exposed. Each plea for understanding is met with cold calculation or emotional manipulation. Over time, the empath learns that their voice, no matter how sincere, cannot reach a heart that has closed itself off to truth. And so, the empath begins to fall silent. This silence is not the absence of courage. It is the arrival of wisdom. It is the deep knowing that some truths do not need to be spoken to be lived. The empath realizes that continuing to speak is not a sign of connection, but a symptom of entrapment. And in choosing silence, they begin to disentangle themselves from the narcissist's emotional web. Every moment of non-reaction becomes a declaration of freedom. Every breath taken in silence becomes an affirmation of self-respect. This silence begins internally. The empath stops overthinking, stops rehearsing conversations, stops obsessively analyzing what they could have said or done differently. They stop internalizing the narcissist's projections. They begin to trust that their truth does not require external validation to be real. The mental noise quiets, the emotional static fades, and in that stillness, they hear the voice of their own soul again. A voice that had been drowned out by the constant noise of manipulation, guilt, and emotional coercion. Externally, the empath's silence becomes unshakable. The narcissist, accustomed to provoking reactions, begins to falter. They try the usual tactics: sarcasm, guilt, tripping, anger, false vulnerability, but the empath no longer engages. There are no arguments, no justifications, no emotional outbursts. The narcissist throws their script, but the empath has walked off the stage. And the narcissist whose power depended on that script being followed is left to face their own echo. This silence becomes a mirror. It reflects the narcissist back to themselves. Without someone to react, to affirm, to argue, to soothe, the narcissist is left with their own emptiness. And for someone who thrives on control and emotional dependency, this silence is torture. It is the collapse of the stage on which they performed, the dismantling of the power structure they relied upon. The narcissist may rage, may beg, may accuse, but nothing penetrates the empath's stillness, because the silence is not passive, it is active, it is conscious, it is disciplined. It is the empath holding space not for the narcissist's games, but for their own healing. Silence also allows the empath to regain sovereignty over their nervous system. They are no longer being constantly triggered, no longer in a state of hypervigilance. The body, once tense and on edge, begins to relax. The heart, once guarded or overwhelmed, begins to soften, not toward the narcissist, but toward the self. The empath begins to feel safe in their own skin again. They begin to recognize the sound of peace, the feeling of equilibrium, the presence of themselves without interference. This silence is not about cutting off love. It is about redirecting it inward. The empath no longer spills their energy into a bottomless void. They no longer leak their soul trying to fill someone else's emptiness. Instead, they conserve, they protect, they nourish, and in this containment, they begin to glow again, not for attention, not for validation, but as a natural radiance that returns when energy is no longer being siphoned. The narcissist may escalate in response. Silence to them is dangerous. It means loss of control. It means they are no longer the center of attention. They may accuse the empath of being cruel, unfeeling, or manipulative. They may try to provoke, bait, or even simulate transformation, but the empath does not move, because their silence is not about power over the narcissist. It is about power within the self. In time, the empath begins to expand in this silence. What once felt like suppression now feels like space. They begin to fill that space with creativity, with stillness, with intention. They begin to remember who they are without the noise of someone else's chaos. Their world, once narrowed to the emotional turmoil of another, begins to widen again. Possibilities open, dreams return, the soul breathes. Silence also teaches the empath to listen, truly listen. Not to words distorted by ego, but to energy, to intuition, to the subtle cues of truth and deception. They no longer need long explanations or dramatic stories. They feel what is real. They sense what is off. Their inner knowing sharpens. They no longer need to argue because they trust what they know. This is not arrogance. It is alignment. This level of silent alignment radiates outward. Others begin to feel the empath's groundedness. There is nothing to prove, no need to explain. Their presence speaks. It tells the story of someone who has walked through fire, learned to sit in stillness, and emerged not hardened but wise. The empath's silence becomes a lighthouse, not just for themselves, but for others who are still lost in noise, still seeking answers outside themselves. There are times when silence is misunderstood. Some may see it as weakness, indifference, or avoidance. But the empath no longer needs to correct that perception. They are not living for external approval. They are living in accordance with their inner truth. And that truth does not always need to be shouted. Sometimes it only needs to be honored. The empath also discovers that silence is not isolation. It is communion with something deeper. In silence, they meet their soul. They meet the divine. They meet the parts of themselves that were silenced long ago in the effort to be accepted, to be loved, to be enough. Now in the quiet, those parts speak again, and the empath listens, not to fix, not to heal, but simply to be with them. This depth of presence is something the narcissist can never understand. They seek power through noise, through disruption, through attention. The empath, having stepped out of that matrix, now lives by a different rhythm. They are no longer defined by their past, by the pain they endured, or by the chaos they survived. Their silence is not a reaction, it is a state of being, and in that state they thrive, not because they won, not because they punished the narcissist, but because they remembered themselves. They reclaimed what was never truly lost, only buried beneath layers of noise, drama, and self-betrayal. Now, through silence, it rises again, whole, undeniable, free.